Hey Raider Nation, we're back again with another Heavy on Raiders production here to discuss everything happening around the team as the preseason carries on. I'm your host, Austin Boyd, and we're here today with Heavy NFL's insider, Matt Lombardo. What's up, Matt?
Austin, great to be here. Not quite the silver and black, but I tried to get it pretty close for this one.
I'm not wearing any silver and black, but I think you're good in that regard. So I've seen that you've been traveling around some camps. Have you had a chance to stop by Raiders camp yet?
Yeah, we haven't gotten out to Raiders camp, but spoke to a couple sources about the Raiders going into this today to try to get the lay of the land of what's going on out there in Las Vegas in Josh McDaniels' first year as head coach. And I think it's a really fascinating team in what's likely going to shape up as the most competitive division in the entire league. So a lot of storylines, and I think that they're going to be a really interesting team to watch. That's for sure.
So, you mentioned that you've talked to some sources. I don't know if you've had a chance to talk to them about this specifically, but have you had what are their feelings on Josh McDaniels and kind of like this next step for him after obviously we've seen him be a coach before, that didn't work. So the Raiders are banking a lot, like playoff team last year, so they're banking a lot on the fact that Josh McDaniels has gotten over that hump.
Oh, for sure. And I think it's not just Josh McDaniels, but it's the stigma of former New England Patriots assistants, former Bill Belichick disciples. They go out on their own and they find out when they're building their own program, it's a little bit different when you don't have the backing and the muscle of the Patriot way. So I think that where Josh McDaniels is really set up pretty well here is unlike Joe Judge in New York, unlike Romeo Crennel during his time in Cleveland, unlike a lot of these other former Belichick assistants, he has a pretty damn good quarterback in Derek Carr. There's a lot of talent around Carr on that offense, and they went out over the past two off seasons. They've built a really dynamic defense, especially in the front seven. And you look at Patrick Graham and you look at his success. He was one of the more sought after candidates the last two hiring cycles as a potential head coach. He lands with a lot of experience on Josh McDaniels' coaching staff. They know each other from their time together in New England. So I think that it's not just whether or not Josh McDaniels can take this roster to the postseason, it's can he be the exception to the rather lengthy rule of Bill Belichick disciples and former assistants going out on their own and not seeing a lot of success. That's going to be what he needs to prove he can do and separate himself from the rest.
Yeah, and I mean, so Josh McDaniels, he's obviously, I'm sure they probably look at it away as Josh McDaniels is the overall head coach of the offense, whereas Patrick Graham, like the defense is his thing. McDaniels probably doesn't really have a lot of input on like the day to day there. So when you're talking about the Raiders offense, they have weapons everywhere. Like they might have one of the best trios of receivers in the NFL in Devontae Adams, Darren Waller, and Hunter Renfrow. The problem is, though, the offensive line has been talked about a lot. The preseason games haven't really helped squash that fear. So, do you think that the offensive line is going to be good enough for this offense to be as good as it can be?
Yeah, I think that, you look at the addition of Devontae Adams, and I think that that's going to mask some of the issues with the offensive line because he's so good after the catch. He has such a strong rapport with Derek Carr that Carr doesn't need to go through all of his progressions. He's going to be able to get the ball out quicker to Devontae Adams and let him make the plays after the catch. He can also stretch the field a little bit. And you also have an absolute battering ram in Josh Jacobs at running back. So again, I think that the offensive line might be the weak link, as you mentioned, Austin. But I think the talent is there to overcome a lot of that because it's a quick read and react, get rid of the football offense. You don't need to sit back there, especially with the talent they have, and go through 3, 4, 5 progressions on a given play. So I think that this might be one of the rare exceptions where both the running game and the talent they have at receiver can kind of mask some of those concerns up front.
Yeah, well, no, yeah, and I think it's also I think another thing to keep in mind is that the Raiders they've had Tom Cable the last few years, who has had success, but he's been a very hit or miss offensive line coach. Whereas like in New England, Carmen Brasilla, the new Raiders offensive line coach, he's still relatively young. I think he only has 2 or 3 years in the NFL, but coming from New England, like they never really had those big superstar offensive linemen, but they always had a really good offensive line. So it could be McDaniels is banking on well, we have talent, we have a coach, we have a stud left tackle. Like that should be enough to get us to where we need to be, and then we can use that money on players like Devontae Adams and extending Hunter Renfrow and Crosby and all those guys.
For sure, and it's also system continuity, right? You think about a head coach coming in, and he has an offensive line coach who he knows and trusts, knows how to maximize that offensive line. So I think that this is one of these areas, one of these teams where, again, you look at some of the pass rushers, and obviously you got Chubb in Denver. You look at the front seven of the Kansas City Chiefs. There's a lot of talent there. They're going to have their hands full when they go up against Bosa and Khalil Mack. So there are going to be times of concern, but I just think that Derek Carr is good enough and the weapons are explosive enough that they can overcome some of those worries.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you've mentioned Derek Carr a few times, and it sounds like you're pretty high on them. And I feel like that's becoming like a couple years ago. He was kind of a punching bag. Like he was not considered one of the top like 15 quarterbacks, but that really changed after last season. And it's easy to forget that when everything was clicking for the Raiders, that he was Pro Bowler, MVP candidate, just as good as like as exciting a young quarterback as there was in the NFL. So do you think that he can get back into maybe as like a dark horse MVP candidate this season?
Yeah, I don't know that he has the upside to be an MVP candidate because just looking at division, Austin, I mean, you're looking at, Justin Herbert, who I think has the chance to make a real leap into that conversation as a front runner. Patrick Mahomes, obviously a guy who's going to be in the conversation every single year. Russell Wilson is going to make the Denver Broncos a lot better. And then you look at Josh Allen, who's probably a top 3 quarterback in the league, playing for arguably the most complete roster and the most dynamic offense in the NFL in Buffalo. I think Carr has the chance to really elevate the Raiders. I think that they have the chance to really make some noise because you look in the AFC West, I think there's a really good chance that you're going to have one 12-win team and then 3 other 9 to 11 win teams jockeying it out for a wild card berth. And he might get hot at the right time and lead them into the postseason. But I just think as good as they have the chance to be, that division's just too good. It's too loaded. There are too many good quarterbacks, elite quarterbacks on that side of the bracket that I'm not so sure that Derek Carr can separate himself enough to be an MVP candidate this season.
Yeah, and I mean that's the biggest problem kind of facing the Raiders this season is they made the playoffs last year. They got a new coach, and like whatever you think of McDaniels, like he was a sought after coach for a while, even after the Broncos debacle. So it's like they have a lot of good things going for him. They got Devontae Adams, they got Chandler Jones. Reports out of camp is that Max Crosby looks even better than he did last year. But then you run into kind of a freight train of competition in the AFC West. So where do you kind of see the Raiders stacking up with these 4 AFC West teams?
Yeah, Austin, I think that if there was a gap at all between the Kansas City Chiefs and the rest of the division, I think that closed this offseason. I'm really incredibly bullish on the Chargers. I think that the Chargers might actually be the team to beat in the AFC because I think that their weakness was on defense. They go out and they bring in J.C. Jackson. They take care of Derwin James this week. Obviously, Herbert has the weapons around him to make a real leap and potentially a lengthy postseason run. And I think it's really going to come down to the Chiefs and the Raiders jockeying for position for that number 2 spot in the AFC West. I think that the rosters aren't that much different. I think that the loss of Tyreek Hill is really going to be an issue from a game-breaking talent standpoint on the outside and Patrick Mahomes' offense in that scheme. And I think the Raiders, with the stability of Derek Carr, with that running game, they can really control the pace of the game in the fourth quarter. You have Darren Waller. You talked about the edge rush talent with Chandler Jones, who was just a monster addition opposite of Max Crosby. I really like what they're building there, and they have Denzel Perryman there as well to really be a veteran presence in that front seven. So I think there's a really good chance that the Raiders are maybe the second or third best team in the division, and if that's the case, there's a real good chance they could return to the postseason this year as at least a wild card in the AFC.
Yeah, I'm glad you didn't. I'm glad that it doesn't sound like you're buying the Broncos hype too much because I'm definitely not. I know we're talking Raiders right now, but yeah, I don't see the Broncos as the biggest threat to the Chiefs in the division, especially considering like they got an untested head coach. Who knows what you're going to get from Russell Wilson this season? And I think their weapons are vastly overrated for some reason. But obviously that's going to be popular to say on this on this live stream. But yeah, no, it could be interesting. The way I look at it is that the Chargers improved, but the Raiders were better than the Chargers last year, at least in terms of final record. And the Raiders also improved too. So it's really just going to come down to is the J.C. Jackson, Khalil Mack edition better than the Chandler Jones, Devontae Adams, Josh McDaniels editions? And it might be, but I mean, I think a lot of it comes down to Brandon Staley, and I think most people probably agree with that because that Chargers roster is absurd. Like, there's no reason they shouldn't be contenders, but it'll be a really interesting. It's such an interesting division this year because there's so many moving pieces.
And Justin Herbert. I mean, listen, I think that there was a lot more pressure on Justin Herbert a year ago because they needed to score 28, 30, 33 points to win because that secondary was a sieve. And I think that with the defense getting better, bolstering the pass rush, adding the premier cornerback on the open market in J.C. Jackson, it takes a lot of pressure off of Herbert in the offense. And Austin Eckler might be one of the more underrated running backs in the entire NFL. So I think that the Chargers have a really dynamic roster. But I agree with you. I think that the Raiders have the pieces in place to really make a run as well. And that's why I think that you see so many of these AFC West games in prime time coming up because it's the most talented division in football. It houses the best set of quarterbacks in the NFL of any division. And I think that, you put all these teams into a hat, it wouldn't shock me one bit if any of them emerged as the division champion. I mean, you could make a really strong argument for the Raiders. I agree the weapons aren't quite what you need them to be in Denver at this point, but there's still talent there. KJ Hamler, when healthy, can be a game breaker. Cortland Sutton is pretty dynamic as well. And that defense, I mean, there's some playmakers on that side of the ball in Denver. You put all four of those teams in a hat and pick them out, it wouldn't shock me whoever wins this division. And it's all conjecture at this point too, which is going to make this so much fun to watch.
Well, yeah, it's so there's so many unknowns too. It's not like there are so many predictable things. It's like, well, how are the Chiefs going to react without Tyreek Hill? How is Devontae Adams and Derek Carr going to mesh after all these years away? And then how is Josh McDaniels going to be as a head coach? How is Nathaniel Hackett going to be as a head coach? How is is J.C. Jackson truly a star, or is there a reason the Patriots didn't want to bring him back? Like, there's so many variables, so it's going to be super fascinating to watch.
Yeah, it's not like a lot of these other divisions where you can look at like the NFC East, where there might be two clear-cut teams battling it out for the division lead. It's not like in the AFC East where it's kind of the Bills and everybody else. This is going to be the most competitive division in football. And I think that, you have the pieces in place. You have the players at all three levels of all three defenses. You have some dynamic playmakers on offense for all of them. And you have arguably the best top to bottom four quarterbacks of any of these divisions. So that's why I think it's going to be so much fun to watch the AFC West and watch the Raiders and see what they can put together.
Yeah. One of the interesting storylines to come out to kind of change the subject away from the AFC West. One of the interesting storylines that I think came out recently was the Josh Jacobs trade rumors based on him playing in the first Jaguars game, and that never really made a lot of sense to me because he's still on a rookie contract. He's only under contract for the rest of the season. He's a Pro Bowl running back when healthy. And Zamir White, though he could be dynamic, is still kind of an unknown because of the ACLs. So are you, and Josh McDaniels did come out and say they're not going to trade him. Are you buying the rumors that they aren't shopping him? And same goes for Kenyon Drake. Like, Kenyon Drake took 17 snaps in the last preseason game. They've restructured his contract. He's kind of falling behind Amir Abdullah in training camp based on reports. So yeah, are you buying any of these running back trade rumors?
I'm certainly selling the Josh Jacobs rumors because, like you said, when you have an affordable running back on this roster, the moves don't jive. If you're going to trade for Devontae Adams and drop him into that wide receiving core, and you're going to go all in trying to make a run this year for a Super Bowl, you don't take away one of your three most explosive weapons on offense, and that's what Josh Jacobs is. You don't take that away going into this year. So I don't see the Raiders shopping Josh Jacobs, I don't even know that you see them, trading away Kenyon Drake, because when you look at some of the teams in the NFL, the move seems to be trying to pair your star running back like an Ezekiel Elliott with a Tony Pollard, because you got to keep these guys fresh. You got to keep them fresh late in games. You got to keep them fresh late in seasons. And both of these guys are affordable at this point. And I don't like to read too much into who's playing, when in the preseason, who's taking, snaps when they shouldn't be on the field early in the preseason. Although it was kind of eye-opening to see Josh Jacobs out there, but I just don't understand, even, if you were playing him and you were trying to shop him, why expose him to potential injury risk in an additional preseason game in the Hall of Fame game? So I'm not really buying it, Austin. And I think that when you look at the makeup of this offense, yes, it's the weapons and it's the playmakers in the passing game. But a lot of the bread and butter, especially down the stretch last year, was Josh Jacobs pounding the rock, shortening games, protecting leads. And you're going to see more of that this year, because I think the Raiders are going to put up a lot of points.
Well, yeah, and towards the end of the season, they don't make the playoffs without Jacobs had a rough start to the season because he was banged up, but once he got healthy, once he started getting more holes from the offensive line, he was irreplaceable in that offense. And he largely has been through the whole Gruden era, because whenever he was out, the offense just completely stuttered. And yeah, his numbers haven't been as great the last 2 seasons, but that shouldn't really take away from the true impact he has. And adding a player like Devontae Adams should only help Jacobs. So it never made sense why they trade him. The best they'd probably get is a 3rd or 4th round pick. So is that really worth it? I wouldn't think so.
Especially when they're not up against the cap. I mean, I could see if he was a big money player and you didn't want to sign a running back to a second contract or a third contract if he was already making big money. They have $22 million in cap space. They have the second most cap space in the NFL behind the Cleveland Browns. So to me, the only motivation to trade a running back is to try to recoup an asset, to clear cap space, and cycle through, draft a young running back, send that money elsewhere. But the Raiders are kind of in this sweet spot where they have a lot of money to spend. They have a dynamic roster that's loaded on both sides of the ball, top to bottom. And the running game late last year was a focal point to them making the postseason. So I just don't see what the motivation would be to trade a player with so much upside at this point for the Raiders or Jacobs.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, I don't think and this might be his last season with the Raiders based on his contract, but yeah, I don't foresee a trade happening unless it's part of some crazy blockbuster that nobody's seen coming, which we can't rule out because we've had so many of them this offseason. But we've talked a lot about the Raiders offense, but you've kind of touched on the defense a little bit, but I want to go more into that. So one concern that I have is you have an elite edge rushing duo in Chandler Jones and Max Crosby, but we're not seeing a lot of interior pass rush juice from anybody on the roster yet. Bilal Nichols and Jonathan Hankins just came back from the PUP list, so maybe they can provide that. But I was wondering if you think they should take a look at a player like Ndamukong Suh, somebody who can really generate that interior pass rush.
Yeah, Austin, I actually spoke to a source right before we jumped on this afternoon, and they basically told me that the old adage of you can never have enough pass rush rings true in this situation. We talked about the cap space. They have $22 million in cap space to spend. This is one of the few remaining needs they have along that front seven, and they told me not to rule out Ndamukong Suh. They mentioned Malcolm Brown as a guy to watch who averaged about 3.5 sacks per season through his first 5 years. Those two guys could fit needs from a scheme perspective. They could fit needs in terms of, solidifying not just the pass rush, but also from a run stuffing standpoint in that division. When you look at the running backs that you're going to have to face twice a year in Denver, Kansas City, and of course, Austin Eckler in Los Angeles. So I would expect between now and the regular season, the Raiders to make some sort of move because they have the ability to do so to bolster the interior pass rush.
Yeah, no, I think that's something that they've lacked for a while. Because even last year, Yannick Ngakoue and Max Crosby was a very good outside rush duo. But yeah, they just never really had that juice on the inside. Darius Philon was a good player for them last season, but he got hurt, and I think he might still be recovering. So I know they've taken a look at him, so he might be another option for them to look at too. But perhaps to me, the most interesting position group on the entire team is the secondary, because you don't have a lot of big names. Like, yeah, like everybody knows Rocky Sin because he was a second round pick. Same thing with Trayvon Mullen. Like a lot of like names that people know, but you don't have Casey Hayward like you did last year. You don't have Stephon Gilmore or JC Jackson, any of these guys that the Raiders were linked to. Um, do you think like what do you make of the Raiders secondary? How good do you think it could be? Because they've really banked on youth with players like Nate Hobbs and Trayvon Mullen and Rocky Sin.
Yeah, I think it might be if there's an Achilles heel on this roster and on this defense, that might be it. But they obviously have a lot of faith in Rocky Sin, and I really liked him coming out. I really liked what he was able to do during his time in Indianapolis. I think he has a lot of upside, but they're going to need him to step up and kind of anchor that secondary, especially when you look at we talk about the names of the weapons in that division. You talk about the weapons at wide receiver they're going to face throughout the league. But I think that the Raiders secondary benefits a lot from having Chandler Jones and Max Crosby. And if they do make a move for that interior pass rush along the front three, quarterbacks aren't going to have a lot of time in the pocket. So I think that being asked to defend receivers for a lot less time, a lot shorter routes, not having to, cover time for 3.5 seconds out there and letting guys, break open or break off their routes because of the pressure on the quarterback, that's going to really help those guys and kind of be the best friend to that young secondary.
Yeah, I mean they do. It's a really interesting group because Nate Hobbs showed a lot last season, and people are very high on him, and he's starting to play a little bit more on the outside. Trayvon Morig was really good as a rookie, as the free safety. The biggest question marks are going to be Jonathan Abram and strong safety. Like he's had some moments, but he's also had some really really ugly moments. So if he can step up in that strong safety role and play well, mean a lot. Trayvon Mullen is another guy. He was picked just a couple picks I think before Rocky Sin in that draft. He's another big cornerback who could be better in kind of the man to man scheme that Graham likes to run, opposed to a zone heavy scheme that Gus Bradley ran last year. So it's interesting. There's a ton of upside in the secondary, but it's very low floor, high ceiling kind of group. And it's like, is that what you want to bank on when you're facing Wilson, Mahomes, and Herbert? Maybe not, but I mean, it seems like every free agent cycle, some team spends $100 million, not $100 million, but they spend a ton of money on a cornerback who totally flames out. So maybe this is the correct approach, but I guess it's going to be a wait and see.
I'll say this, I've covered the NFL as a beat writer for 10 or 11 years on the Eagles and Giants beats, right? Patrick Graham was one of the brightest football minds that I've covered. And I think that when you look at what he does in terms of adapting his scheme and his game plan week to week, matchup oriented, that's going to be a real asset for the Raiders this year. But, you talk to people around the league, around various teams, especially on defense, it's really hard for a guy to walk in year one as a defensive coordinator with a roster that's largely inherited, that they don't have, quote unquote, their guys to build around and implement that scheme in the first season. So I think that maybe expectations for the Raiders defense should be tempered just a little bit. But the flip side of that argument is two of those pieces are Chandler Jones and Rocky Sin, who were handpicked by him. So I think that this could be the year where Graham lays his foundation with a lot of the players that have been there through prior regimes. But he's the type of guy that's really going to get the most out of his players, because you talk to his players, you talk to the Leonard Williamses, you talk to Xavier McKinney, you talk to guys who have played for him in New York. They love playing for him. They run through a wall for him. They echo the sentiment about him being a bright football mind. Year two is when I think that the Raiders have a chance to make a legitimate leap, especially defensively, regardless of how good that division is. And I think that's one of the reasons why Josh McDaniels and the Raiders looked at Patrick Graham and said, he's the guy we want running this defense, because of what he did in New York, what he did in Miami. And once he gets his pieces in place, once he gets his players and gets around them for an entire year or two, they have a chance to really take off.
Yeah, no, I mean, you bring up a really good point, because it's very possible that it's a rough start for the defense, because you're going from Gus Bradley, who is cover three purist. That's a system. He wants to keep it simple. He wants everybody in certain spots, and that's just how it is. Whereas Graham, I spoke to Cleveland Ferrell at the NFL draft, and he mentioned how Graham just has specific like plans for every player. Like it's a very tailor-made scheme for the roster, which is an interesting. Definitely an interesting approach, and I mean it's worked for him in the past. So let's see. Let's give him a little time before we're ready to jump ship on him, because it's easy to forget. Like he might, if the Raiders defense is awesome this year, he's going to be a head coach.
For sure. I was kind of surprised
Yeah.
he didn't get a head coaching job this cycle.
Yeah, so he was a huge get for the team, like possibly as big as getting McDaniels, because the Raiders defense, I think, I can't remember, but I feel like ESPN did a list of like the worst defenses of the decade, or like the all worst defensive team, and the Raiders were rated as the worst defensive team from like 2010 to 2020, which isn't great, but the hope is that at the very least, even if Graham does get another job after the season, he has the building blocks there to where it's a long-term sustainable defensive system, opposed to like, oh, we got him for a year and our defense was awesome and then it was terrible.
Well, big picture, Austin, and I just got a text message coming in while you were talking about Patrick Graham and the defense. Good news for Raiders fans is, talking to a league source, he told me it's a, quote, total culture change in Las Vegas. And there's a lot of positive vibes emanating from the building, and that the players are bought in. So I think that when you have guys that are buying into the system on both sides of the ball, with Josh McDaniels and Patrick Graham, and a lot of talent there, I think that that's where you could be one of those surprise teams. You could be one of those sleeper teams because you have the talent matching the buy-in, and that doesn't always happen in this league.
Yeah, and it's also like, keep in mind like how great of a culture builder or offensive mind was John Gruden during his time, or was he overhyped? Like maybe this roster was a lot better than people realize. Maybe Derek Carr had a much higher ceiling, because there were so many times. I mean, even Darren Waller said on the Bussin' with the Boys podcast recently, he's like, yeah, I never really knew what we were doing in the red zone. Like they never really seemed to have a plan. It's like, you have a 6'6" tight end who can jump higher than most of your wide receivers, who runs a 4.4. Like, why is he not in the red zone game plan for every single game? So I'm hoping, the hope is that things are a little more deliberate with the offense and the defense.
Yeah, and just the entire team and the entire culture. That was a lot to go through last year. I mean, you talk about everything that happened off the field. You talk about everything that happened with John Gruden, and the emails that came out. You talk about, Bisaccia coming in and getting players to run through a wall for him, and they loved playing for him. Obviously, you bring in a new regime, but from the sounds of it, the players are just as bought in on this new culture and this new vision as they were in Rob Bisaccia. So I think it's going to be really fascinating to watch it unfold.
Yeah, and that was definitely a big fear. Is like, you're going from Bisaccia, who was beloved, to a guy like McDaniels, who is perceived as kind of prickly, like Bill Belichick Jr. And definitely, like, Raiders fans were super concerned about that, but it seems to be working out well. I know McDaniels is considered a top play caller, so like if he could get the culture down, like we're not like the offensive play calling isn't a concern. It really comes down to the culture that he's building. So if he can get that down, it seems like he's getting it. Perhaps this could work out very well for the team, who's had a dozen head coaches in the last 20 years, maybe.
It all comes full circle to the conversation we had at the very beginning, right? Can Josh McDaniels be the outlier? Can he be the one former Bill Belichick assistant, not named Nick Saban or from that tree, to go and have a lot of success? So it's going to be really, really interesting, and there's a lot riding on not only this year but the next several years as well.
Exactly. Should be an exciting season. Are you gonna come out to Las Vegas for any games?
We'll have to see. If they're in the mix late, if they're in the postseason, we'll be out there for sure.
Awesome, cool. Well, that's everything I got for you. Do you have any more insider info you want to give our Heavy on Raiders page before we leave?
Watch out for Mac Hollins, because obviously the Raiders' two wide receivers are set at the top with Devontae Adams and Hunter Renfrow. But everybody I talk to says that Hollins is tearing it up in camp, and he's going to win that number 3 wide receiver job. So he'll be a guy to watch. And look, Mac Hollins is a guy who he's been through the battles. You know, he's been in competitive situations with the Eagles during his time in Philadelphia. And I think that he's one of these guys that could really flourish with all of the attention that's paid to the other weapons on that offense.
Well, and Derek Carr loves to spread the ball. He loves big wide receivers, which is evident by Darren Waller having over 100 catches in back-to-back season. Not last season because of the injury, but prior to that. So Mac Hollins, yeah, definitely could be a sneaky good pickup by the team.
No doubt.
All right, Matt. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully we could do this again at some point during the season.